we have the audacity to tell a family that we can take better care of your kids than you can, then we better do it. I saw time and time again in working in the child welfare space is that the longer children are in care, the less likely it is that they are connected to the communities they came from. They weren't connected to anyone. They often didn't know anything about their families. And so on top of being heartbreaking, it also really stirred in me this focus on where is this child's people? Children don't come into custody because of something they did. So children come into care because their family's needs are great, whether that's interpersonal violence, whether that's substance use, right? Whatever that might be. But over time, the longer they're in care, it starts to become about what a child's needs are, which really fascinates me since we created the trauma for the child within the system after the child experienced great trauma. Don't tell me about a service. Tell me about what the child needs. Don't worry about the services we have, the fancy names, the acronyms we've created that make no sense, and what do we know about this family, and tell me what this child needs.
Nicole, welcome. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you over the last year and a half, maybe. And you have stepped into this amazing role at Centene, VP of Product Development, right? Which is a big shebang. We're talking about bringing all of the new products, all of the new things to the communities that you serve, which is a huge opportunity, responsibility. I'm sure all the things that come with it for you. And I'm really excited to talk more and just learn about like what that means and what you're excited about and focused on. I would love to know, though, you are a clinician by training, and I'd love to know, like, what drew you to clinical social work in the first place?
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here as well. What drew me here? So I did undergrad at Chapel Hill. My undergrad degree is in psychology, and I'll start off, hopefully make folks laugh a little bit. I'm not sure I knew what I was planning to do other than I liked it. I've always really enjoyed social sciences. And so I think it was really my first experience sort of getting the breadth of social sciences in a university environment and just eating it all up. And when I graduated, I actually went to work doing direct care in the homes of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that is actually where I encountered my first social worker. And what was really neat is I don't think I had an idea of what social work really was until I met this person. And she was kind of like, hey, you can do all kinds of things with this. And really I think what really interested me too is thinking about how I could support kids and families and the community, but that it also extended into multiple types of settings, into hospitals, into schools, and then also looking at it from a higher level, thinking about policy and thinking about how some of those decisions impact things that happen on the ground. And so I suppose the rest, as they say, is history. I sort of applied to school and went off to graduate school and sort of jumped in feet first.
Amazing. I'm sure that it was only, one or two steps between here and there to you to get where you are today. It's interesting that you called out policy. Were you always interested in the policy side of things, or was that sort of like something that developed as you went on in your career?
Great question.
Because I don't think I've ever heard a social worker be like, early in my career, I was excited about policy.
That's a great question. So I think it was super early on, but I think the real, I guess, light switch went off for me in graduate school because I had the opportunity to take a course at the School of Public Policy at Columbia, and they let you take courses at other accompanying schools, and I was hooked. Like, I was all there. I wanted more information. I wanted to learn more. And I think that really came from sort of having the opportunity to both see something on the ground and then also recognize, like, what are all of the, like, when I back up from that, what's everything that got us here? What are all the decisions that were made? What happens at the local level? What happens at the federal level? So I ended up pursuing a minor and taking a ton more classes at the School of Public Policy too. So I think I started early in my career with a real interest in knowing, hey, I do want to get my license, so I do want to do direct care work, but I also think I eventually want to end up doing something that has more of a policy impact.
Super cool. What a cool experience for them to just let you kind of frolic and find what you did. Do you remember, were there any like cases or any things about that class that you still remember of like, wow, that really hooked me into policy?
Yeah. So I haven't thought about this in years. So there was a visiting speaker in the class, a former mayor of New York, and he was a trip, Patrick, like an absolute trip. And I remember one of the things he talked about was he used to walk around the streets of New York as the mayor and talk to people. And he said of all the things he'd learned, of all the degrees he held, of all the different things he'd done in his life, those experiences were the most impactful to him in making decisions for the city of New York. And I think that really stuck with me because I've always been someone who loves to hear people's stories, like and experience perspectives and soak in, what makes people tick. And so it resonated with me that, wow, this gentleman, like where he got and the decisions he was able to make, and for him to sit in front of us and say, the most impactful thing I did during my time in office was have coffee on the block. And I was like, cool.
Yeah. It's a very humbling experience to hear things like that. And I hear it so often. Like when I ask all the amazing people across state, Kelly, Senator Bergen, like it always was, we went and talked to people. Like we just went and did that. And I don't know, I come from a world of product design where that's kind of like foundational, or you got to talk to people who you're building for, otherwise you have no idea. But I don't think that idea is like permeated that deeply across many other disciplines, especially not policy. So that's a very powerful experience to have early. What a cool mayor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you got really excited about this social work thing. Like, tell me more. Did you spend more time in direct care? Was it with more IDD focused populations, or was it more general? Like what did the early days of Nicole's social work life look like?
So my second year, you chose a concentration. And so I actually chose children and families as my concentration after lots of sort of careful thought and consideration about populations that I really enjoyed working with. So my second year, I was placed at a child welfare agency in New York City. And that was, in so many ways, something that jump-started a real interest and love I had in the child welfare space. And so I spent that year really, talk about tossing in an intern, but in the best way. I was given a caseload. It was like, here you go, Nicole. Let's figure it out on the job.
It's work.
But I learned just an immeasurable amount. But I learned not only about the child welfare system and the system itself and how it works, but I learned how it impacts individual families. I learned it on the adoption side of things because I got to work with children who had been freed for adoption. They were placed with family. We were waiting on some things to clear, so like they had a path forward. But I also worked with children who had just come into foster care, where I was working with the biological family still, navigating through care plans and all kinds of things. So I got to do a little bit of both. But that really, I think, set me on the trajectory toward a real interest in child welfare and a real desire to make sure that I had on-the-ground experience before I stepped into maybe more of the policy administrative side of the house, if that makes sense.
So it's like a self-education. You're like, I need to know this.
That's right. And I knew I wanted to do it too. I really wanted to be in it and just soak up as much as I could. And I think learn about myself in the process too. And then at the time, I always knew I was headed back south at some point. A little bit of my personal life thrown in here. I got engaged to my now husband in graduate school. And so I moved back down to North Carolina and encountered, in a lot of ways, a very different system with certainly some similarities. But I had to learn an entirely new system and do that in a clinical space as well. So supporting children and families, and also learning a new state really for me, because it's not where I'd gotten my education, and it's not where I'd sort of learned all of what I had.
You said that during that time I wanted to kind of educate myself and learn, but I also wanted to learn about myself and my role as a clinician. Like, what was there anything that you like really felt like you changed in working with the people directly?
I think what's real about becoming a clinician is school is a part of it. But the experience of connecting with families, understanding the complexities of what goes on with every family being so unique, every child being so unique, you start to really learn how to be a therapist in a real way. So you're actually practicing what you've learned, but you're recognizing that you have to mold and adapt and be flexible. And then also having the experience to be trained in different types of modalities and different types of clinical strategies, and continuing to stay well informed. So the other thing that was always really important to me is to continue to stay well informed in research, specifically in pockets and spaces where I was doing most of my work. So I have always worked in the Medicaid environment. I've always worked with children and families who receive Medicaid. I've always supported children who intersect with complex serving systems, so the child welfare system, the Division of Juvenile Justice. So that became something I also needed to learn a lot about, and then sort of how I understood those systems and the role I played in supporting families in encountering those systems, I think.
So it sounds like that was the part that really prepped you for coming back to North Carolina, which I'm sure, because you'd spent time thinking about that, you'd had your experiences in grad school thinking about policy. Coming back here, sounds like you had a much bigger picture to think about the system than
That's right.
Probably most people. So what did you observe when you came back to North Carolina about the differences between the systems?
The first thing I observed was we had less resources. Very candidly, I remember, it's funny how you remember specific moments when you're serving families, but I remember I was serving a family and I was looking for a specific type of support for the mom. And I remember calling one of my coworkers and describing something that I had in New York as a resource. And my coworker sort of chuckling, and I was like, does your laugh mean that's not here? Does your laugh mean I'm not going to find that resource here? And she was like, I've never heard of such a thing, Nicole. And so just, again, very transparently, there was just less. There were less resources to go around. There were less services of the same type. So I was doing very prevention-oriented work when I came back to North Carolina. I was doing something called multisystemic therapy. So I was working in homes with families, with children who had pretty significant behavioral challenges and emotional needs, children who had already kind of encountered, usually, they're monitored by a parole officer, or they've encountered juvenile justice in some ways, primarily through that pocket of youth. Because you were so focused on the youth family support in New York with more resources, like, was there a glaring hole? Yeah, so I think in coming back to North Carolina and doing prevention-oriented work, I recognized that so much of the system that I was working within was so far downstream. Like, I started hearing about all these supports and services for kids when things had gotten so far out of hand, and when a family's needs were so much greater, and the conversations felt different in the work that I had been doing in New York. We often had so many more resources, prevention-based resources at our disposal, and even things maybe that aren't as traditionally sort of clinically seeming. So we were talking all the time about families' basic needs. We were talking all the time about how to support families, from everything from food support to transportation support. You know, our agency was doing so much of that work. And so it was just a real shock to the system, to be honest, to come down here and start encountering situations where I felt like, gosh, we really needed to do something like years ago. And here I am in the middle of this, and I'm trying to support it. But wow, we're pretty far upstream here. and things aren't going well for this family, and now they have a young child and a teen child, and we've got things that have really spiraled out of control. And then I started to hear and see so much of that in the public serving system. So a lot of the recommendations and things that I was hearing as I was first learning the system down here, as I was starting to hear from people, well, that child could be removed from the home, and here are resources that child could get outside the home. And that felt so counter to all of my clinical training, to everything I knew about how kids heal and get better, to really just decades of research that tells us how families heal and how children really thrive. And so those things very early on in my career coming back to North Carolina started to feel at odds.
Big realization to have coming back, like, oh, we are under investing in the upstream. What was your first step?
I think one of the things that was really important to me was to start telling people or sharing with people some of what we know about our kids and how they get better. And what I mean by that is I was in so many conversations where we were like checking the boxes, Patrick. So it's like, we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And what I started to really do in my own clinical path was stopping to say, okay, well, what are we trying to solve for? And I have always believed, and believe now, decades later, that families are the solution. They're always going to be the solution. They've always been the solution. And so when we keep that at the center of the recommendations that we make and the way we look at support, I think we get better as a system. And so I think one of the first steps for me was really just to start having candid conversations. I suspect if you were to meet anyone that knows me in this space that's worked with me, they would say, and I've heard this actually a lot from my colleagues at the Department of Social Services, and it's such a compliment, and I've always held it dear, is Nicole tells us the truth. When we ask Nicole a question about a kid or a family, she tells us the truth. And then they'll always quickly say, even when we didn't want to hear it from her. And I take a lot of pride in that, because I think sometimes that's where it starts is, okay, well, here's what we know. Here's what we know. Here's what we know about this child or this family's presentation. And I'm a big believer in, yes, we're in this experience and we need to know this family well, but we also need to lean in on what we've looked at. And in the child welfare space, we've been doing research on this population of children for decades. And research has continued to tell us the same thing. And we should be doing those things. Like, that's what we need to do to help take care of families. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff we layer on top of that, but that should be our guiding force. And until we're directed someplace different, that's really what we should be doing.
So you've been now pursuing this path for many years, and I'd love to know, like, what do you feel like has worked? Like, where, since I've become part of this North Carolina continuum of care, it's been very clear to me that the focus is on prevention. So the cultural narrative has definitely changed.
Yep.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what has tangibly changed. Like, what did I not see go from not so good to better in terms of since you've been here? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's a great question. So I think we've had wonderful providers and organizations that have poured into this space for all the right reasons. They've brought best practices here. They've looked at things in the way that you should, which is, does this work? Do we know that it works? Do we have evidence that it works? Do we know who it works for? So we have options, because there's no one size fits all. So do we have different types of programs and supports for different types of families? Have we looked at culturally appropriate care? Do we know who lives here? Who lives in our state? And what are they telling us their needs are? We've listened to people. So we've had services and supports where it's been engaging individuals with lived experience, engaging with people who are experiencing whatever it is that they're experiencing, and then feeding that information back into a system to make it better. and continuing to do that. And so I think in a lot of ways, there has been a real pouring into the community and a real pouring into the provider community in particular. I think I really attribute a lot of what you just shared into that space, which is providers speaking into that space about taking care of families, and being brave about the work too, pushing into a system a little bit. It's hard to get a system to move. But when you push into that system, and you continue to do that, with good data and good programs, and then I'd be remiss not to also say that continuing to watch the public sector, what I call kind of the public and the private sector, but maybe a blending of all of that, but continuing to watch the child welfare sector, the juvenile justice space, all of those areas work in partnership with the provider community and the organizations doing this work. I think that's moved the system forward. And then the state. I mean, the state deserves credit. DHSS deserves credit here in North Carolina for having their eye on that and recognizing that there needed to be some real investment in that space and movement in that space. I think we have a ways to go. Not that every state doesn't. But we've got some work ahead of us too, but I think we've made some real movement and people have worked tirelessly to do that.
Can't happen without the people delivering the services and help, but also can't happen without the leadership to set in the right direction. And I think I was impressed the level of clarity and also the breadth of like the plan the Department of Mental Health plan had for the state, because I hadn't seen that as well articulated anywhere else. So not surprised that those are two of the things that you found have changed. My obvious next question is like, what hasn't? Like, what has been a harder problem to solve than I think either you anticipated or maybe you did anticipate it? But like, what are the things that are still around that still need to be addressed that you are still thinking about, still like trying to figure out? And when I say you and we as the community, I guess.
Right. It's interesting. I sometimes step back from a question like that and think about what I've experienced just in my own life in terms of mental health and access to care, and then what I experience in my working life and how some of the same needs exist in both spaces, and that's really interesting to me. And so I even think about access is still a problem. It's still a problem in the commercial healthcare space. More and more folks are not taking insurance at all. And so that's a huge problem, not just in the Medicaid community, but it's a huge problem in the community more broadly. And it's a complex problem because it's not just about building a stronger network. It's also about how we invest in these services and how we support clinicians in order to be able to stay in this space and do this great work. And I think we have a long way to go there. We don't like to talk about money, but the reality is that mental health practitioners are struggling, and really good ones often leave this space completely and move into a private pay environment, which means that you have then a very, very small pocket of individuals who have true access to some of the most talented clinicians in this space. And the vast majority of people, if they need mental health support, the reality is they need brief intervention, usually by a licensed clinician for a period of time, right? That ends. That's the vast majority of people. And so if we even look at access in that way and we have a problem with that, that worries me because then we look at, okay, let's look at more complex populations of individuals. Let's look at problems across systems that we're trying to navigate and specialized services. I think then we start to have other types of issues when I look at the system. We have poured a lot of financial resources into congregate care settings over time, into new hospitals. And there's one part of me that says, great, there's resources going into mental health, Patrick. And then there's another part of me that says, is this the best place for those resources? we have spent a lot of years in this state taking some of our most complex populations of children primarily that cross over a lot of the systems we've spoken about today and place them in what we call very high levels of care, North Carolina terminology, but place them in services and supports that are in these types of settings, and they're incredibly expensive, and we don't show a lot of promise from the outcomes they get. And so we are continuing to do that. So even though we are continuing as a state to make strides upstream and invest in prevention-oriented support and services and bring innovations to North Carolina and creativity into this space, we are also pouring money into the far end of the crisis continuum in a way that has me a little concerned when we talk about scarcity of resources and making sure that we're plugged in the right space.
Yeah, it's kind of that's always a tough problem, because when you've got this level of severity that warrants that kind of supports, you have to take care of it. You can't not. But the solution to reduce the need on that is what you've talked about.
Right.
Catching people way earlier, years earlier.
Right.
And if all of your resources are going to just putting out a fire, it's hard to divert that into stopping the fire from happening anyway.
Right.
So I can hear in your voice the frustration with it, and I share that with you for sure. But I also, man, it's a hard problem when you're trying to make these decisions, and you literally are. Like, this is now part of, I think, the work and advocacy that you're doing. How are you approaching this problem, or these sets of problems? Because there's many different problems, and like, do you have a process by which you identify and think about which are the problems that are worth going to solve? Because I mean, you are doing this now at Centene. You're leading the team to bring some of these new products to market, these new solutions to the community. You can only do so much at one time. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about this? Like, how do you prioritize? How do you decide? Do you go out and walk around the streets of Charlotte and Murphy County? Like, tell me, like, how do you figure out what to do?
I think what you started with, just in terms of the two together, you have to do both concurrently, right? I think for me, I always start with, not to sound cliche, but I always start with best practice. What do we know? What do we know about how children get better? What do we know are best practices based on diagnoses? What does data tell us? We're going to sound like kind of a nerd, but when we look at our population of kids and teens, what do we know about them? How are they presenting? We have the unique perspective as a health plan that we can do some predictive analytic work too, right? We can take a look at what we see happening, what types of services that we're paying for, what we can see diagnostically happening when children or families go to the doctor's office or go see a clinician, and start to see, okay, well, what does this look like? What is this population presenting like? North Carolina's produced some of that data about what we're looking at with our kids. And then how do we know how to treat some of those things, right? I think for a long time, our mental health system was sort of built on this idea that if this doesn't work, then you do this, and if this doesn't work, then you do this. And I'd like to hope, perhaps, that we've come to a place where instead of looking at kids that way, we look at kids sort of uniquely as individuals and say, what's happening with this child? And then not what's available to us, but what do they need? One of the things that I used to ask people all the time when I was practicing was, don't tell me about a service, tell me about what the child needs. Don't worry about the services we have, the fancy names, the acronyms we've created that make no sense, and someone trying to navigate through all of that. What do we know about this family? And tell me what this child needs. What do you see as the clinician as the problem? What are we trying to solve for? What types of supports does a child need? If we look at the child systems surrounding a child, where are all the places that we need to get plugged in? What's going on at school? What's going on in the community? What's going on with the family? What's happening in the child's friend group? What's the dynamic at play? What diagnostically are we looking at? So what here is biological in nature, right? Where is pharmacological intervention considered best practice, and where are we stretching things here? And then let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about that in a multidisciplinary way. I think that's how I've always started to look at all of this, because when we start like that, and then we start to look at how we make investments, like if you trend your data and you see what's happening in your communities with your kids, then start looking at, okay, well, what is it that we have in this system, and what are we able to do to help meet those needs? And then sort of how we started that question, what does it look like when our kids are in crisis? What types of support are we looking at? And what should we be doing? What are we doing because we're scared of something happening to a child? And so we run and we act and we do something, versus what have we learned over time is best for a child presenting in this way? And are those things that we're trying? And do we have the right workforce to do that work too? So that's probably where I would start. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And it sounds like you start with understanding the needs of the community.
That's right.
Like you have to have a deep sense of, for this community, what are the things that are happening?
That's right.
You get an opportunity to match that with the data to see, okay, how large of a problem is this emergent? If it's a big ballooning problem, that's probably something to look at. Right. If it's potentially on trend with what you would expect from a normal year, you say, okay, I think we're doing that relatively well. And then I think the last part is also, I'm not exactly sure what the word for it is, but you're also trying to make an assessment of like, how adequately are we meeting the solution in the most effective, humane way possible, right?
That's right.
Sure, maybe sending police, as an example, out to 911 calls that are for a mental health crisis. Maybe that's effectively, stabilizing the situation, but maybe that's not the right way for us to actually prevent whatever sort of negative externalities we want for that situation. Like, is that kind of the way you think about it?
Yeah, that's a great example. I think that's exactly right. And I don't think we're going to get it perfect every time, but I think sometimes in some ways we have inundated the system with services and supports and all kinds of things. And that's great. We have a lot to choose from. But I think we also need to know our communities, and we do. I should give us credit for knowing our communities. I think North Carolina's done a really nice job at that. But that's, I think, where the rubber meets the road too, is like, we know what our communities need. We got to make sure we ask the community too about what they need, and we're plugging in the right way. And we're really, I think, as a system, committing to getting as far upstream as we can, while still making sure that we have crisis support and crisis management supports in place.
Go for me 5 years into the future. Like, it's, what is it? 2030. We're sitting here. Everything has gone right. Like, if you were to just dream up a plan for what our system of care here would look like, what would be different, what would be more effective, like, what would that look like to you?
I think I have a unique perspective. I'm going to pull a Nicole and say something before answering the question. I think I have
You're
kind
allowed.
of
You're allowed to do that.
I have a unique perspective, I think, from having worked at the tail end of the system for so long in really high levels of supports and services for kids, that I think if I had my dream 5 years from now, I think that we'd see a child continuum of care that was robust upstream in terms of supports in home, outpatient support. We'd also have a really high level of understanding of families' basic needs and some of the additional, maybe creative supports that families often need to maintain and to continue to thrive. And that would really be built into that work upstream. And I would really like to see a focus on some of the downstream services and supports that we know are best practice, and really start to move away from some of the spaces where we have just not seen as good of outcomes come from those things. And so an example I might say would be, we're still doing a good deal of group care in North Carolina, particularly for our children who are in the child welfare space. And that does not yield great outcomes. It never has. And so I'd really like to see that work transformed. A lot of those agencies are already doing some of that. Some of the agencies who do that work are already trying to transform how they do that work. But I'd really like to see us moving into a space where a lot of those services have either moved toward helping children transition back into the community, into long-term settings, or helping families get where they need to get, and so they can have their children returned to them. I always say in clinical care, children have to be rooted to a community, to a family, to people. We know that. We know that children have to have at least one person who they're connected to, who is grounding for them. All children deserve that, but they also need that. And really our whole continuum of care should really be focused in that space. So 5 years from now, I think I'd really like to see continual expansion on some of these community-based programs that have shown to be really successful, continuing to bring in sort of this peer work and peer support work, because that's been really meaningful. I'd love to see outpatient services and supports. I'd love to make sure that children have access to psychiatrists who need them. But I think I know a lot of my experience in this space has been working within services that the vast majority of people know nothing about. Most people don't know very much about different levels of foster care or types of foster care. Yeah. They don't know very much about what we call level 3 group homes or different types of group care. They don't know about psychiatric residential treatment facilities, other than maybe they drove past an agency one time and saw an acronym. But I know a lot about those types of services and supports because I spent almost my entire career working within them or adjacent to them. And so I would really like to start to see movement in that space that is not continual growth. And I say that because we have to keep our children in the community in order to drive what we're trying, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for our kids. They happen when our kids are in the community. And earlier I said something about families being the solution. And one of the things that I think I saw time and time again in working in the child welfare space is that the longer children are in care, the less likely it is that they are connected to the communities they came from. And that's not just the families, but it's all the people that were part of their community. And so I would often encounter, in a lot of the work I did when I worked in residential care, I would encounter children who had been part of the child welfare system the vast majority of their lives. And so they didn't know where they came from anymore. They weren't connected to anyone. They may have still had a family member around, but not one that was going to be some type of long-term plan. They often didn't know anything about their families. And the system that they were part of didn't know about their families either, because they were taken from their families so long ago. Wow. And their parents' rights had either been terminated or there were a number of things that had happened. And so enough time had passed where I was encountering child after child after child where no one could tell me anything about them other than their diagnoses and what appeared on paper. And it wasn't even always clear if everything was true because it had been moved from paper to paper. And so it wasn't totally clear if that was the correct presentation. And so on top of being heartbreaking, it also really stirred in me this focus on where is this child's people? Like I used to say that in child and family team meetings, someone tell me where this child came from. Where are his people? I know he has a grandma somewhere. I know he has an aunt somewhere. Don't tell me he doesn't have a cousin. I'm looking at a 15-year-old young man. These people exist there somewhere.
Yeah.
And I used to remind my team when I oversaw care management, I used to remind my team a lot, although I didn't have to really be reminded because they were wonderful, caring people who thought about this a lot, but reminding ourselves that children don't come into custody because of something they did. So children come into care because their family's needs are great, whatever that might be, right? Whether that's interpersonal violence, whether that's substance use, right? Whatever that might be. But over time, the longer they're in care, it starts to become about what a child's needs are, which really fascinates me, since we created the trauma for the child within the system after the child experienced great trauma. And then we start talking about what's wrong, if you will, with a child. And that stirs something in me, even talking about it now, all these years later, having worked with kids for so long. That's totally wrong.
Yeah.
We're completely backwards.
Yeah.
And if we create a system for the most complex children that is all about focusing in on how they're struggling to navigate this environment that we've put them in, that seems so counterintuitive to what makes good sense. Of course, a child struggling in an environment like that. Of course, a child who has no connection is struggling. The child should be struggling.
Yeah.
Because we know a lot about how kids develop, and we know how important that is for a child. And so
for any human,
for
any adult,
yeah. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that became almost every child I served in residential care.
Wow.
And then I had some real moments where I thought, this cannot be. We cannot continue to do this. And what role do we all play in that? What role do I play? What role does everyone around this table play if we're around a team meeting? What role do we all play across systems? And I think that's where things, it feels like we have a responsibility as people who do know. So if we work in this space and we have a great deal of education in this space, we've studied this, we've worked with these children, we have studied how family systems work, we need to make sure that we are talking about that, and we are talking about what we're seeing, and we're talking about where things are not making sense. And then what are we doing about it? That became really important to me. And when I left direct care, it's something that has I've kept tethered to years and years and years later, because it's the right thing to do for kids and for families. But it also matters so much, because if we don't do better, then to your question about 5 years or 10 years, like, you have to start moving the mark. And some of what that means is really hard conversations about where we're not cutting it and where we've got to do better. I had a boss years and years and years ago in a very angry display to a group of us at work, but with the greatest message, but he was not pleased about something. I don't even remember what he wasn't pleased about at this moment in time, but something. And he said to us, if we have the audacity to tell a family that we can take better care of your kids than you can, then we better do it. And I remember thinking, oh God, like, what a responsibility, but also he's right.
Yeah.
Like, we are going into people's homes and we're taking their children from them. And for all kinds of reasons, many that do make sense because of what a child's experiencing and what's happening in a family, some that maybe don't make as much sense. But when we take children into care, particularly when they're older, we're not doing a great job of taking care of them.
It's so powerful to hear you speak with such conviction and clarity about this, and so obvious that the work happens starting from a separation. Like,
That's right.
The work is not the separation.
That's right.
And I don't know if this is just me, because I haven't been in the space for two or three decades, like, working in it, but as someone who's just relatively new to it, in my head, even though I don't think I consciously would have communicated this to be the way, there's part of my view of the space of child welfare as like, protecting them by getting them away, but that's not true at all. And so I think, like, dispelling that myth in the story that you just shared feels like really needed and really powerful, because you're so right. Like, if what we all want, and I believe that to be true, that anyone working in the space really wants the best thing for these kids, for any kid.
That's
like
right.
You wouldn't do that if you didn't care.
That's right.
If you really want that, you, to your former boss's point, you have to be able to deliver on that. And if you can't, I think what it sounds like you're saying is, in a lot of situations we can't actually. We got to find ways to keep them in the community with their people.
That's right. That's right.
Super powerful.
And I believe the other thing I heard in graduate school that we used to say all the time is we have to believe that people are doing the best they can. And as a clinician, if you ever stop believing that people are doing the best they can, you need to move on. It's the other thing we used to say. It's time to move on, because most people are doing the best they can with what they have. And that includes parents. And if you work in enough situations where you get to meet families who have lost their children, there is great compassion you will feel for their stories and their experiences that led them to that moment, whatever that might look like. Generational trauma, years of fighting addiction issues, poverty, deep poverty that impacts everything. It touches everything like a virus. It just is, it's just so, it's heartbreaking, but it also informs so much about then where we go next. And we start to look at those situations even before our system encountered families and think about, what can we do as a community? What can we do better when we look around to take care of one another and to support families in the right way? And I think, there's so many thoughts I have about that, but I think that's ultimately, so much of that work has to then inform how we build what comes next, if that makes sense. So if we do that well and better, we're never going to do anything perfectly, but if we do it better and continue to do it better, and to your point, there's so many people that care and whose not only hearts, but also momentum and work and what they've built is plugged into the right space, then we watch a system move and change. It's possible.
How do you maintain your optimism that things will get better?
Because I believe in people. I really do. I believe in the people who are doing this work. I was just at a provider conference this past week, and I was telling a coworker today that the provider community is so special in North Carolina. And I also told her something, a word I always use. The behavioral health provider community is so scrappy. They're so scrappy. They're great. They know how to work it out. They're flexible. They're creative. They've been bringing new investments and new ideas into the space for a long time. I think that if we continue to do and to build on where we've been and where we're headed, that gives me great optimism. And I also think leadership is important. One of the things that I have come to understand over time, so I do believe, to bring myself back to earth for a second, I do believe that we all have to be working toward the same outcome. And I don't know that we're 100% there. I think sometimes systems put themselves at odds with each other almost unintentionally. And the child welfare system is a great example of that. The Department of Social Services has in some ways an impossible mandate. Keeping children safe. Well, isn't that really the responsibility of all of us? Right? And goodness knows they'll make the news if something happens, if one thing goes wrong, if they've counted on the wrong family and something didn't go okay, or they made the wrong call on a call they went out on one time. And unfortunately, in a space like this, really awful things are going to happen, even when people do everything right. But I also think that we have to partner with the Department of Social Services as a community, as a provider community, as a payer community. And we all have to be marching toward how to take better care of families in the right ways. And there is some risk involved, because if we're moving away from a system where we continue to place children, there is going to be some inherent risk involved in that, because they're going to be in environments that feel less controlled by us.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to work as a system to figure out, well, what does that mean? And how do we get better at then making sure that they're safe there too, but that there is a bit more risk. And there is going to have to be some movement in that direction. And we're going to have to do that work together, I think. And really support that work, and really support the work of Child Protective Services, where the vast majority of families that are touching that system actually never have their children taken. They encounter that system, and we used to call this in school too. It's like, those are those pivotal connections. Like, you've encountered a family, so what do you do? What do you do with that? What do you learn about them? Usually it's a very, very fast encounter. There's a lot of state regulation and federal regulation around how long you can stay involved with a family. But you've encountered a family at a pivotal moment because they've come to your attention because they're in need of something. So what does that mean? Right? Do we give a family a list of resources and close a case? Or do we figure out what's happening in the home and try to plug in resources in a creative way? Does the family have basic needs issues, and are those needs being met? So I think there's lots to be done there, and there's lots of creativity that it can exist in that space. And I think managed care is a really, really cool addition to all of that, because they can bring lots of innovation and lots of support in that space too. But will have to be working toward a common goal, and I don't think we're there quite yet. I think because we have different responsibilities, it doesn't make the goal always the same. I do think that we're all trying to help. That is a common goal. But I might say one level below that might be, what are we trying to accomplish, though?
Yeah, outcomes matter.
They matter.
We're going to need to do a whole part 2 on what the future of the system should look like, because I feel like you got so many thoughts. But to make sure I don't take up your entire afternoon, let's end on it's a question that I ask all of my guests here, which is, there's infinite problems, but if you could snap your fingers today and just solve one problem that would impact either youth in foster care, youth mental health, youth health and well-being in general, like what would you snap your fingers and do?
Truthfully, if I could snap my fingers and truly do what you just said, I would make sure that every child has someone in their life who loves them. I would. That's what I would do. Because I think sometimes when we spend a lot of time talking about child welfare, we also talk about youth mental health. Truthfully, they go hand in hand. We spend a lot of time talking about those big buzzwords, and we forget sometimes that people are human beings too. And what we really need is connection. And so if I could snap my fingers and do that, I would create a space that everyone feels loved and cared for.
Beautiful. Thank you, Nicole. You have a beautiful mind. I'm so glad there is someone like you working on this problem.
Thank you. I appreciate that.